this life was all I ever wanted.
I'm not leaving. Not yet.
I was hoping you'd say that.
We gotta hit the streets, make some money.
People like us must destroy people like him. Buckle up.
Get Showtime free at Showtime.com.
This one was really interesting to me, BC. Robert Whittaker broke his silence. I think speaking to the Daily Telegraph was the name. Obviously, he had a fight at UFC 248. He pulled out of it. He may still take on Darren Till in the future. But there were rumors at the time that he had pulled out because his kids had some kind of bone marrow issue and needed a transplant. And he says, it was crazy rumors. He doesn't know where any of that's coming from. And in fact, what really happened was he was burned out. He was burned out. I want to start with this one in asking the question about how believable we assume this to be. Here's my response to this, BC. I would love to get your perspective, but let me go first if I may, which is I completely believe that what he is saying, I have no idea if what he is saying is true, but what he is saying has all the hallmarks of it because we've seen it over and over and over and over again with other champs. I've asked Israel Adesanya, the man who dethroned him, how do you keep up this travel schedule and this training schedule and this fight schedule where you're constantly in camp and you're not burned out? How do you do it? We've seen it with George St. Pierre. I one time interviewed him. This was before the Hendricks fight, before he took that sabbatical. And I'd never seen George so mean, so rude, which is so unlike him. But I knew he wasn't a mean or rude guy. He was just completely wiped by the whole process. So the things he is saying are true. And remember, this guy had injury after injury, hard fight after hard fight, time off, and then you get injured and you have to come back and rebuild yourself. And you have a tough fight, you got to heal. You have to come back and rebuild yourself. And you had last minute cancellations. And the pride of a nation hangs in your hands. And it's just a lot to weigh on for a guy who's got 3 kids and he wants to be home. That story he's telling is true, and I don't want to give credence to the rumors. They were unsubstantiated. The bigger outlets who usually can, figure out what's what, they never said anything about it. The only thing I want to caution people against is a lot of times fighters will say things to the media that are not true, and they might do it to protect a loved one. Is that happening here? I have no reason to think that it is. I have no evidence. All I'm saying, BC, is I'm not saying those rumors were true or that the story he's saying is false, but rather always keep a little bit, just a little bit, of their comments about things like this. Take them with a grain of salt because you never know the motivations they might have for saying them. But I believe he probably was burned out, and if that's the case and he's got that under control, he's still young enough, if he hasn't taken too much damage, BC, to make another run at that middleweight title.
Yeah, I tend to believe him because I think there's evidence in there. His body constantly giving out was a message that there was an overload. This grind was too much. And I think if you really read the details of that story, this epiphany came to him on Christmas afternoon when he's running hills like a maniac to prepare for a next fight. And, he explained how when he transitioned from welterweight to middleweight and really went all in on the sport, and his coaches said, look, if you train at this level, if you get your mind right and you get to this level of warriordom and you live this, you could be, limitless potential. You could be champion. Well, he lived that. He got that. But there is a price to pay for that, Luke, when you're around the clock, around the 12-month calendar like that all the time. His body broke down. I wouldn't doubt mentally he was breaking down, which George St. Pierre was very open and honest about when he did step away from the sport. That, like you mentioned, that pressure of game planning and protecting and defending is got to be, heavy as the crown. We know that. So here's my point on this. I think the best thing that could have happened to him was that recent defeat and this opportunity to reset. Athletes need this. It's certainly harder in the UFC when you can't just take a year off. There's pressure to defend. The interim titles pop up. You can get stripped. But when you look at somebody like Floyd Mayweather, who very strategically took off key elements in his prime. I mean, do you remember in 2007 when he beats Oscar De La Hoya, knocks out Ricky Hatton, and becomes a mountaintop star, the biggest draw in the sport? Well, boxing, you have more leverage. He was allowed to step away from the sport and control his own narrative, and he worked on things like WrestleMania and Dancing with the Stars to build his brand. But those next few years when he was already in his early 30s, he's sort of hand-picking fights once a year and taking off the time that he needs to heal his hands, to heal emotionally and physically. You cannot do that again in the UFC if you are champion and have a long reign, which is why I think we need to pause more often and look at the kind of streaks that George St. Pierre, Anderson Silva, and John Jones went on, because they're ridiculous. And Amanda Nunes is currently going on to mentally and physically be able to retain all that. Everyone's body is different. Everyone's mind is different. I really respect Robert Whittaker for coming clean about what happened, because when he pulled out of that recent fight, it was obvious that something out of the ordinary happened. And I don't think it's any harm done should he take as much time as he needs to reload, because Luke, time away from any grind, especially our jobs when we're going 100 miles an hour, juggling, projects and going nuts, you got to be able to reload, and that isn't always given for an opportunity when you're on top.
It's interesting. Tom Lawler told a story about overtraining as well, where he didn't even realize how overtrained he was, and then he went into the weight room for a weight training session. I think picked up a barbell, and then in a way he can't explain, dropped the weight, went back to his car, sat in his car, and broke into tears. Because his body and his mind was so fried by all of this, and he wasn't even aware of it until you get to a breaking point. That's usually the problem. You either reach some kind of physical breaking point, which you had indicated, or a mental one, and they're both kind of bad, but at least at this point he has an opportunity to reset. You think of these fighters as like they're so in tune with the fight game and what they have to do that they are able to figure everything out about themselves and about the task at hand. And the reality is, what often they're doing is just throwing the book at the wall and seeing what sticks. And until they have understood that process of trial and error, and like, I can do this and I can skip that, it usually is run until the wheels fall off and then they make a change. I wish there was some kind of way to have an intervention before they get to that point, but I guess we'll have to see if training, how it gets better in the future. The one challenge I would say to what you said, though, Brian, is you had Floyd. I think you're right in the sense that it was good for him to take time off in the times that he did. But part of that was, one, the leverage scenarios and how important he was as a promotional feature for any television network or any rival fighter he was going up against. Right? It's a big to-do when he competes. But the more important part is Floyd was ahead of the game. He had time to take off because his peers were not as good as him. And I know at the end of his career, he got a little bit selective about the timing, about when he would take certain fights and under what circumstance. Canelo a little early, Cotto a little late. Okay, fair enough. But you can't really do that in modern MMA, not merely because the promotion won't let you, but because if you do, chances are the game will just pass you by. We'll find out if that's the case with Dominic Cruz, as we indicated with UFC 249. But it brings up something we've talked about a lot on this show and really just privately, and then it's a discussion point in the industry. People mocked Fedor for having great wins and then cans, and then great wins and then cans. Yeah, but the reason why his streak was so long is because he had those breaks in between. I'm not saying that the UFC needs to completely change their mode of business, but what I am saying is Robert Whittaker is not going to be the last guy to be ground into dirt. And if it's a way to avoid that by giving them other potential matchups in the interim that don't drain them in that kind of a way, I don't know why that's the worst idea in the world.
And also what's a really bad idea is fighting Yoel Romero for 10 rounds in the span of like 13 months. That'll break you down physically and mentally. And that's avoid that at all costs.
Last thing on this before we go to the DMs with Donks, do you like the idea of tune-up fights in UFC, or are you against them?
I mean, at face value, do I like it? No, because what has made UFC so successful that there's no tune-up fights unless you're at the Conor McGregor level, which even then, it's so rare. But yeah, I get what you're saying. You can't keep. I mean, it's really, Luke, absurd what Silva, GSP, and Jones have done over that long length of time. I know Anderson Silva fought a couple of Patrick Cotes in between, but you get my point. It's unsustainable for boxing or MMA to take hard fight after hard fight, and that's why so many of the greats from the 80s in boxing that we love had very smaller windows careers at the very top. It's hard to do, but yeah, a little bit. If you can lower it just a little bit. I mean, Dominic Cruz for Henry Cejudo right now is sort of that perfect matchup like we talked about, where it hits the entertainment, it hits the storyline, but will it be as much of a physical grind if he got in there against Peyoche Yan? Probably not, Luke.
And we haven't talked about it. Conor McGregor taking all that time off. A lot of it might be related to indiscretions outside the cage or whatever other issues are happening in his life. But if that keeps him fresh and he's able to get back and compete, we'll see how things go with travel. It may not be the worst thing in the world either, you know?
Yeah,
We'll
you've
have to
taken
see
a lot
it.
of time off this show, and look at it. You're as happy as you've ever been right now, Luke.
I've not taken multiple times of time away from the show. What are you talking about?
Well, it let Chuck Mindenhall come into our lives, so I didn't hate
Yeah.
it, but it gave you
Yeah,
the rest
exactly.
you need to put a smile on your face.
You're welcome. How about that?
This life was all I ever wanted.
I'm not leaving. Not yet.
I was hoping you'd say that.
We gotta hit the streets, make some money.
People like us must destroy people like him. Buckle up.
Get Showtime free at Showtime.com.